I grew up listening to the CBC, it's just a part of my childhood. It was always on, it was that voice kind of going in the background and, that you could learn something from.
I'm 77 years old. I've lived with the CBC almost all my life.
I tune into the CBC daily, and to think that it might be threatened by cuts and eventually disappear one day, it's quite upsetting.
It's important to have a strong national public broadcaster because it defines who we are as a people and gives us a voice.
Represents a lot of multiculturalism.
Reflects the bones of the country, the heart of the country.
It's part of our culture, right? I mean, it's been part of Canada for so long.
Something that's wonderful about the CBC is, I can call my parents in the Midwest and they've seen the same story and we can chat about that story and have that connection.
It is the only network, the only organization that brings this country together. East, west, north, south, there is nothing else.
Brilliant documentaries, unbiased reporting, which is so important now, especially now.
It's actually been an incubator of amazing local content that reflects the multiculturalism of our country.
I think it's terrible that Canada ranks at the bottom among Western democracies for its funding of its national public broadcaster.
I feel angry about the cuts and frustrated and despairing about the direction of our current federal government.
You're just crippling the CBC. And in the end, I don't know where it's going to go.
CBC is crucial, it is important, and it should be maintained, and it should be funded.
I would say that we're really losing a vital part of Canada by making these cuts to the CBC. I think it's incredibly important to safeguard our traditions and our culture.
And by stripping that away, you're really tearing at the fabric of what makes us such a special country.
Welcome to this Friends of Canadian Broadcasting online production from Ottawa. As a result of budget cuts, the future of our national public broadcaster, the CBC, has been very much on the public mind in recent months. And with a general election on the near-term horizon, the parties are sharpening their political messages. With this in mind, Friends has invited the leaders of Canada's federal political parties with representation in the House of Commons to provide Canadians with their vision for CBC's future. Second up is Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party. I am very pleased to introduce the great Don Newman, who will host this session and interview Ms. May. Over to you, Don.
Well, thank you, Ian, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Webcast. It's the second in our series with the party leaders. And thank you for joining us, Ms. May. It's very nice of you to be here, and we have quite a few questions from members of the public that have written them in and want to hear your answers on the future of the CBC. But many of the questions, frankly, I don't want to be rude, but they're saying essentially, you don't have any hope of forming a majority government after the next election, so what really can you do?
Don't shock me at the beginning of the interview.
Well, I don't want to be rude,
no.
But they say that that's not going to happen, and you may want to disagree with them, but if it doesn't happen, what kind of impact do you think you can have on the funding and really the existential crisis that faces the CBC?
And on the existential crisis that faces Canadian democracy. Frankly, Canadian voters would be very wise to want many more Green MPs because we're going to have a minority parliament. And virtually everybody thinks it's going to be a minority, whether it's Justin Trudeau or Tom Mulcair or Stephen Harper, who have more seats than each other in their parties. They're unlikely, very unlikely, to have a majority. And in that situation, what you need is a group of MPs who are more committed to the Parliament, to the country, than they are to their party, willing to work cooperatively across party lines to influence what happens next. And in that situation, the Green caucus is the game changer. We're the ones who say, okay, you don't want to support the CBC, you won't have our support on anything else. We have more influence in that scenario than any of the other parties.
Very interesting. Well, then, how serious do you think the situation at the CBC is? One person wrote in and asked, is Canadian democracy actually threatened because of it?
I think it is indeed. And, you may know, Don, the last couple of books I've written have focused on the question of the crisis in Canadian democracy. And underlying that in a very serious way is the question of the extent to which Canadians are informed about what's going on in the world. The more that our news media is dumbed down, the less actual information we have, the less equipped we are as citizens to engage. And you know, I remember, gosh, we all used to have the experience of we'd all watch Knowlton Nash at the same time. I mean, part of this is the challenge that CBC faces in the digital age, that all broadcasters face, and newspapers. But we need solid information. We need unbiased, impartial, independent sources of information that are immune from political pressure, which means we also have to revisit the CBC model, protect the CBC, fund the CBC, but also make sure it's independent of political influence. It's critical.
Well, now, let's talk a bit about the infrastructure of the CBC in this way, because someone from Cape Breton has written, and I know you have a soft spot for Cape Breton, having lived there when you were, when you were a young person. It says, when the CBC went digital, their 600 plus analog towers were replaced by a mere 20 plus digital towers, and consequently, I can no longer get the CBC from my aerial. In fact, this person writes, the only way I can watch the CBC is by live streaming it on my computer. So do you, Elizabeth May, do you think that the CBC should serve all Canadians and be available to all Canadians? Because I guess we all pay for it.
That's right, I absolutely do. In both languages, across all the time zones, and also including First Nations culture and information as well. Now, when you speak of Cape Breton and the loss of CBC there, I go back to the fight against budworm spraying in the 1970s. If we had not had in that era a suppertime news TV channel of CBC out of Sydney, Cape Breton, I don't think we could have stopped the demands for spraying a chemical that's now illegal. It was the fact of local coverage, back to my point on democracy, local coverage of issues that matter on Cape Breton Island. We didn't just get the cookie cutter news out of Halifax. We had a TV channel. Now Cape Breton, Sydney is down to the radio broadcasts, which cover local news. But losing the ability to watch CBC on your television because of this switch, I think is one of those really unfortunate signs of what happens with cuts. Losing shortwave, CBC International. That was something that could reach people all around the world. And now, for people in repressive regimes, they can cut off access to internet. They couldn't cut off shortwave CBC Radio Canada International, and now we've lost that. I think we have to rebuild a lot of what was cut.
Well, now here's something a little different we're going to watch, because our next question comes from a group of enthusiastic volunteers at the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. So let's watch this.
Okay.
Hello, my name is John, and I'm on location here at the beautiful Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, Ontario. My question is this: as the potential future Prime Minister of Canada, what commitment are you prepared to make to not only keep the CBC alive, but growing? Oh, the good old CBC is A-OK with...
Well, I realize he liked the way he phrased the question. You like it better than you like my first question, but...
Well, I think I didn't mind your first... Actually, I welcome your first question, because it's important for Canadians to think about Parliament and not just, we don't elect a Prime Minister in this country. We're not in the business of running a presidential campaign, although the campaigns look as if we're electing a Prime Minister, we're not. So my commitment, the Green Caucus commitment in a minority Parliament, is to push to grow the CBC. We have to protect CBC, Radio-Canada, television and radio in an age where they face, regardless of its public broadcasting status, conventional TV faces challenges. So we need to know how to compete across all platforms in a digital age, but we need to maintain that role of public broadcaster. And that means we need predictable, reliable, long-term public funding.
But is there, other than the funding, which obviously is key, without the funding there's nothing, but is there another way of a sort of a plan you have or a vision you have for moving the CBC forward?
Well, one thing is we have to make sure the board of directors is appointed in an impartial fashion. We shouldn't have the party of the day, the Prime Minister appointing the board of CBC. We now know that of the 12 board members, 10 are Conservative Party contributors. And I think that the plan, I agree entirely with Alain Saulnier and his critique that this plan that the current president has put forward is a plan to dismantle CBC. It's not a plan to grow CBC. So we need to put in place a board that understands the role of a public broadcaster, has expertise in areas of cultural programming and news and information and the challenges of a digital age, and can take it forward. With the consultation of Canadians, we may need to find, I think we will need to explore innovative ways of continuing to fund CBC, but we really need to make that commitment that we will, as our enthusiasts at the Canoe Museum say, we need to grow the CBC.
So what do you make of the Prime Minister's comments in Quebec last week? Basically, I think he said Radio-Canada employees were leftists and they hate conservative values. Is that sort of undermining the arm's length principle, or is he just sort of campaigning?
Well, I don't think it's a secret that Stephen Harper doesn't like the CBC. I mean, it's part of his ideology is to prefer the private over the public. So when you look at, just one example, sports activities for kids, instead of making sure that school grounds in Canada can stay open, that there's common areas for kids to play, recreation zones for everybody, Stephen Harper's approach is to provide a boutique tax cut to people who can already afford to put their kids in expensive sports and are already in a tax bracket where they benefit from a tax deduction. So it's a consistent practice of preferring, same thing with Canada Post. Eventually, I mean, that seems to be the direction that Harper wants for Canada Post, is that people who want to get things mailed to them will call a private shipper, because we're not going to be bothering anymore to deliver mail to everybody's home. So it's a consistent ideological preference to reduce the common sphere in favor of the private. In the case of CBC, add on to that Harper clearly thinks it's some form of a leftist broadcaster. I have to say, coming from my point of view, I wish that CBC gave more fair and even coverage to issues like climate change. And I think for a while now, CBC broadcasters have been worried about the cuts and have blunted their criticism. I know that may not be a popular thing to say right now.
So do you think this is sort of a self-censorship that you're...
I've seen...
Because, I spent 33 years there, and I don't recall myself...
No, you...
I mean, there's questions of good taste and there's questions of fairness, but I would think that my colleagues, my former colleagues that are still there, I think they still operate more or less the way I did. I don't think that they worry too much about...
Well, I may be...
now, the managers may. I'd give you that. But I think
the individual journalists, I'm not saying that, but I remember clearly during different climate negotiations, I talked to a reporter who'd done a really in-depth piece on climate, only to be told at the last minute it was dumped because there wasn't news that night on the news to have a scientific piece on climate, but Rex Murphy got his rant to say there's no such thing as climate change instead. So that's a small consideration. I think if we had a more independent CBC that didn't have to worry about knowing that Stephen Harper's the Prime Minister, and members of the Conservative Party get up in Parliament, not quite every day, but quite often, and say things like, it's time to eliminate all funding to CBC. And they have petitions to that effect. And I see that as a real warning sign. So I want to make sure that, the kind of comment that Stephen Harper made, I don't think it was an accident. I think he's trying to appeal to some elements within Quebec who don't support Radio-Canada. But that's a tiny minority. I mean, look at the Quebec commitment with 20,000 people marching in the streets of Montreal last November to fight the cuts to Radio-Canada. There is a very strong commitment and loyalty to CBC right across Canada, coast to coast to coast. And Stephen Harper doesn't like it.
Well, I would share your view, though, that it's probably stronger in Quebec. I wish there was more support in the rest of the country like there is in Quebec. But anyway, let's turn this argument, though, on its head. If you're going to help address CBC's problems, how do you, in the other sense, maintain an arm's length commitment? Because once you're sort of into the CBC, can you still stay arm's length and address the problems?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have mountains of good advice from various commissions, going back to Kaplan, Sauvageau, Pierre Junot. We know we need the CBC. We know that the best way to maintain a healthy public broadcaster is to make sure that there's predictable funding. Beyond that, you want to have an independence in choosing who's the CEO, who are the board of directors. And you need to make sure that CBC never need fear political repercussions for good, solid newscasts. And in your case, yes, absolutely. CBC English and Radio-Canada are the places I go to for solid news coverage, because you know it's reliable.
Well, then, talk then about the governance, because, I mean, someone's got to appoint the board, someone's got to name the president. I guess the board could, instead of the Prime Minister, name the president.
That's right.
But but the Prime Minister also gets to appoint the board, and I can't see how else you would get away from a system where the political power appoints the board. So what would you do about governance, and what would you do even say in terms of senior management? Would you get down into that level, or would you just say the board are in charge and they're going to do it all, and if they like the president, they're going to have him, and or how would you do it?
Well, the way we recommend it, and it's part of our full policies are online in a document called Vision Green, so it's in more detail there. But we'd like to see a committee that's appointed that has real expertise in the cultural industry. So it would also appoint the board of Telefilm Canada, also appoint National Film Board, also appoint Canada Council of the Arts, and appoint the board of CBC, with the goal of making sure you have people of real competence, expertise, and knowledge base about not just the content of Canadian culture and news, but also the business of broadcasting, so that you're ahead of the curve on some of the technological changes that are coming at all of the various news media and entertainment channels. With a board that's independent, and of course the question is who appoints the board, but let's say if it's merit driven, if it's based on experience and background, then you've got an ongoing appointments board for arts and culture that's reliable. And then once the board members are appointed, they can select the chair. And that keeps that from being a political appointment.
And they'd select the president too.
Yes.
Yeah. So you have higher funding for culture and the arts, and you would, I take it, enhance the CBC's capability to broadcast culture and the arts. But broadcasting is also a competitive business, as you know.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that comes up all the time, and I think the Conservatives tend to play on this, is, well, there aren't as many people watching the CBC as there used to be, even though they're not doing as much culture and arts. So you might flip it back on its head and say, well, if they did more.
Yeah.
But I don't think people believe that. I think the CBC thinks it has to compete for audiences, and I'm just wondering, you'd enhance the funding for culture and arts, and as long as those programs run.
And news.
And news. Yes. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could put it first. I digress. I guess the real question. The real question.
It won't be a political appointment yet, but let's talk to you about being on the board.
Does the CBC have to compete for audiences? I guess is really what I'm trying to say.
CBC doesn't exist for purposes of competing with private sector media. The CBC exists to protect us as a nation, to create a greater sense of national identity. I moved to Canada as a kid, as you suggest, Alan. When I moved to Cape Breton Island, I learned what it was to be Canadian by listening to CBC radio, watching CBC and Radio-Canada television. That's how I learned what it was to be Canadian. And we heard it from those clips earlier. We have grown up since 1936. Canada has needed CBC. We need CBC now more than ever. Even people like Kenneth White, who used to be a critic of CBC, coming from Maclean's in a more private sector position, saying, look, with these new platforms, if we don't have a dedicated public broadcaster to cover the Canadian news stories, if our argument is audience, why exist as Canada? Oh, we can get all the kinds of entertaining schlock from Hollywood. That might draw a bigger audience. You know, who wants to be the latest rock star who also wrestles? I don't know what's coming next from these idiotic reality TV shows. But we really need CBC more than ever to speak to what's happening to us as a country and connect from coast to coast to coast in both languages across all time zones, reaching every region and relevant to every region. We need CBC more than ever.
Well, one of the things we've heard from people as they've written in with their questions, and I think it's a valid one, they've expressed concern about the commercialization of the CBC, but there is also, I mean, it's kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, because there's also the question of losing the revenue that the CBC used to be able to attract on television to social media. So I'm wondering, how do you see the CBC in respect to the future of advertising, and should it be going after it at all, or should there be no advertising on CBC?
I think that's a question we need to ask and take nationally. I've been consulting with the arts and culture critic for the Green Party, who's Joanne Roberts, who's a noted CBC reporter who's now resigned from her position as the host of All Points West in Victoria. So she's running in Victoria for Green Party and giving me the advice that what we need to do is ask the question. can we do without advertising revenue, and open a consultation with Canadians? What kind of mechanisms would people be interested in looking at? Right now, we can't do without advertising revenue, but I think it's a worthwhile question to ask, and it's worth asking Canadians. Again, the question is, how much do we want CBC? My overwhelming sense from talking to Canadians in town hall meetings and the letters I get is that the vast majority of Canadians regard it as essential to our identity to continue a strong public broadcaster. I believe that that's what we need. If we need it, how do we pay for it? Clearly, it's a question of priorities. In the scheme of things federally, it's a drop in the bucket. It's not a lot of money. And also, it regenerates. You know, for every dollar that we put into CBC, we have $4 benefit in the economy through the production of cultural products, through the stimulation of the economy in other ways. So if we did more, if CBC had the potential to do more film and original television and sell it to other countries, Radio Canada could sell to the francophonie. There are things that we could expand that also generate revenue. At this point, I think we're stuck with television advertising, but we have to hold the line against letting advertising on to CBC radio.
So far, it hasn't been able to attract too much advertising, not as much as they'd hoped, so maybe they could easily get rid of it again. But, you know, if you restored the money that had been cut recently, right, and then you did away with advertising, or the fact that advertising is migrating wherever it's going on the internet, and I'm not quite sure that they're all that happy with it either. But anyway, I mean, there's a lot more money in the future going to be needed by the CBC than just restoring what was cut.
That's right. And our position is that restoring what was cut isn't enough. The $115 million that was cut must be restored, but our platform in 2011 called for $100 million next year, $150 million the year after that, $200 million after that. So $450 million additional just to get CBC back to where you don't have the feeling it's being starved to death. That's bare bones. Then we can start looking at, okay, what else can we do? Do we want to look at the BBC model? Do we want to look at more like a PBS model? Do we want to say that some shows are brought to you by? Of course, we don't have the same foundation community the US does. I don't want to jump to any one of those financing conclusions of how we might replace lost revenue from advertising. But I think it's worth asking the question, how do we do this as a country? In the meantime, stable, predictable federal funding is essential. And goodness knows, there's the amount of money that the federal government has spent advertising itself lately would have been a very neat bump up to the CBC budget.
Well, we've had a passionate response from many Canadians that people do care about the CBC, but they don't always agree on what the CBC should be, and you sort of touched on that now. But how would you determine going forward what Canadians wanted out of a public broadcaster, and is it possible even to determine for a very long term? I would think not, that because everything changes so quickly now, particularly with the internet. But would you have a royal commissioner? Would you have a parliamentary inquiry? How would you determine what people think the CBC should be?
Well, first of all, I have to say it goes based. I don't think things change all that much, Don. I think if you're driven by principles and values, those don't change. The technology changes, right? Yeah. So we talk about this being the information age. I would actually challenge that. I think that the random factoids that are thrown at me daily on Twitter, some are true, some aren't. Meanwhile, does the average Canadian know as much about what's going on in this country as we knew when we all sat down together and watched Knowlton Nash tell us what the news was, right? We shared an experience and we had more solid information. We had stories that ran longer. We had segments that ran longer. We had more detail. We had more information. So I think that the mandate for CBC is to have a well-informed citizenry that's equipped to participate in a democracy, not as consumers, but as participants, as activists, as people who care about saving this country, saving the planet, saving our democracy. You need a public broadcaster for that. So I think the principles are independence of political influence or private sector influence. Being strong in multiculturalism, both official languages, obviously, and speaking to every region, making sure we include clearly the primary role of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people as we go forward. Looking for ways to be innovative to speak to all platforms, because we know young people are not sitting around the TV the way we used to. So we need to make sure that we provide access to a public broadcaster that reaches people on their iPhones and their tablets. This can all be done, and I think the principles, I don't think we need a new Royal Commission. I think we could dust off Kaplan and Sophie-Show, dust off Pierre
You think they're still relevant? Because, I mean, Kaplan Sophie-Show was in the late 80s,
That's right.
Well, it's a really different media landscape now than it was in the late 80s.
But we're the same country. We're the same country with the same challenges. We had the challenge of being overwhelmed by U.S. culture and U.S. Dumbed down media. That's still the challenge. That's still the threat. And we need to make sure we have a strong public broadcaster in response. So we want to consult with Canadians widely. As I said, that's how we want to figure out a new financing model, whether that's something that's through a Royal Commission or through a series of parliamentary committees across Canada, which can be done for a lot less money. I mean, a real outreach through a parliamentary committee that goes across this country and collects the information and really takes the temperature of the country. How much do we as Canadians want to save our public broadcaster? How much do we want to know that our kids and grandkids will have the same experiences of growing up and knowing what it is to be Canadian by hearing the voice of somebody on the other side of the country telling us what they're experiencing? It knits us together in a way that nothing else does, and that's not going to change.
No, I think I agree with you, and you know, when you think, you know, I lived on the prairies, and when you saw Don Messer's Jubilee, you realized there were a lot of people living up with you in Atlantic Canada.
Right.
I don't know if that still works anymore, but you seem to think it does. If it was just done, it would work.
Well, I know how my daughter has experienced CBC growing up. Now, of course, it was always on, right?
Yeah.
So but her sense of connection is different from mine. I'll say, I heard something good on the house this morning, but you missed it. She said, well, I'll just go get it as an iPod. I'll download the podcast. Well, I have to admit this is really embarrassing to tell you. I've never downloaded a podcast. I don't know how to do it. I'm 60, but I'm sure I could learn. The main thing is my daughter, who's 23, downloads the podcasts. So we can make it work for all these different age groups and for the kids that are coming up after them, because I don't see any other answer for maintaining who we are as a people other than having a public broadcaster. There's nothing that the private broadcasters won't have the incentive. They have a clear profit motive, and it's not going to work for them to cover local events that take place on Vancouver Island. There's not enough of an audience on Vancouver Island to justify all of the effort that goes into telling people in Halifax what just happened in Comox, or what just happened in Iqaluit to tell somebody in Toronto. The knitting together piece, given the challenge of geography of Canada and the linguistic challenge and the cultural challenge. I mean, there's so much in politics these days that's always seeking to drive us apart, to say Alberta against the rest of the world, or nobody cares about Atlantic Canada anymore. The thing that tells every Canadian we care about each other is our public broadcaster.
So I know you don't want to get into the funding, but
is
there any attraction to the British model of having a licensing fee and you pay it whether you watch it or not?
Well, I think, as I said, that's a model that we need to look at, but it's one among many. There's the PBS model, there's the BBC model, there's doing something completely innovative and different that would allow Canadians to know that the investment we were making in CBC was returning value on products that we were selling to the rest of the world, right? So there are a number of different ways of going at it. I'm attracted to exploring it, but I'm not convinced it's the right way to go.
Now, a number of people, I know your answer to this already, and it's going to be no, but a lot of people have been writing us and saying, is it too late? Has the damage been done? Is the CBC, can it be restored, or is it going to be reinvented, but it's going to be a lot less than it was? Do you think that so much damage has been done that really the horse has gone from the barn? And
those are the questions we can ask about whether there's any chance of restoring real democracy in Canada where a prime minister isn't a dictator. Is there any chance of stopping the threat of climate change? Is it already too late? On all of these questions, I refuse to say it's too late. We are alive, we're breathing, we're smart, we're Canadian, we can figure this out. We can rescue our parliament, we can ensure we have a strong public broadcaster, we can arrest the threat of climate change. These are things we can do, and they're things we must do. And in this, we have no time for defeatism, and we have no time for apathy.
And do you think the CBC, just very briefly, will it be an election issue? I mean, there seems to be the economy, there's security, there's terrorism, there's the other parties seem to be talking about everything but the CBC, except Mr. Harper when he kind of throws in an ad hominem.
Well, as long as I'm in the leaders' debate, it'll be an election issue, because it's critical to so many Canadians. I hear from, I receive literally thousands of names on petitions. I presented one yesterday in the House of Commons, 530 names, Save the CBC, Protect the CBC, en français and en anglais. I, as a federal party leader, I don't have any doubt whatsoever that not only do I have some kind of personal high-minded idea that we need public broadcasting, I know Canadians want me to go out and fight for public broadcasting, and I will.
Elizabeth May, thanks for your time now. Well, that is all the time we have today, and so thank you for tuning in. And we'll see you for our next installment of the Leaders series about the CBC. I'm Don Newman. So long for now.